I'm Lucas Chancel. I'm one of the directors of the World Inequality Lab based in the Paris School of Economics. I wanted to start with a quote. That's an American president on campaign trail who said that every American should be above average income. And that I will see that my administration makes sure that they get above average income. So, I think there's perhaps no better way to illustrate the fact that we need to reconcile economic policy discourses with research on economic inequality. And this is what we are going to do in these 2 days. And the first step to start with these discussions is really to look at the empirical basis. And so this is what I was asked to do. So this presentation goes with the landscape paper. I will not discuss the totality of this paper. I invite you to have a look at it if you're interested in it. It's available online. So it's about 10 key facts. I will focus on some of these facts. I will have a condensed discussion of points 2, 3, 4, and 5, for instance, which are about the long run and the more short run evolution of income and wealth inequality. I will start with this point on data, which I think is not only important from a statistical point of view, but also from a policy making and a policy discussion point of view. I will not discuss point 6 on global inequality, leaving this to discussions or to the paper. As Olivier was saying, this is really about the developed economy, advanced economies discussions we were looking for today and tomorrow. I will rapidly touch on gender inequalities, on social mobility, and open up the floor to the policy discussions with my points 9 and 10. So let me start straight away with the data issue. So the standard tools to track income and wealth inequality are household surveys, and these provide a rich source of socioeconomic information, on demographic information on households, and they are essential instruments to track income and wealth, but they have well-known limitations when it comes to properly measure the dynamics at the top of the distribution. And this is particularly problematic when a lot of the action is actually taking place at the top of distribution. So there has been a burgeoning literature over the past decades that has been seeking to mobilize other sources of information, including tax data, tax statistics, to make up for the limitations of survey data. This is based on the pioneering work and methodology of Simon Kuznets, of Tony Atkinson, and this literature was developed by Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, Facundo Alvaredo, Gabriel Zuckman, and dozens of researchers all over the world who produced top income share series based on tax data in the long run, and that made it possible to look at these trends from a historical and global comparative perspective. That being said, tax data itself is not deprived from limitations. This is just an illustration of the limits of tax data. In the case of the US, you see the composition of capital income here. These are the Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman series. And what we see is that 2/3 of capital income that is reported in national accounts, that is reported in macroeconomic statistics on growth, are not reported on tax returns. So if the question is, what is the distribution of macro growth, we cannot only rely on surveys, but we cannot only rely on tax data either. And we have to mobilize the national accounts. So this is the project that we have developed at the World Inequality Lab. And again, with dozens and dozens of researchers over the world, we really seek to distribute national accounts, both income and wealth macroeconomic aggregates. And what you see here is just an illustration of this method. For the case of Germany and France, this is the evolution of the top 10% income share over a 20-year time span, where we see that just looking at surveys may mean that we miss both the levels and the trends of inequality. And using tax data, mobilizing national account information will have different implications, different results, depending on the country we look at, depending on the gap between what we observe in tax statistics and what is there in national accounts. So I will be mobilizing largely this amount of information, this empirical basis in the next few slides. First fact, income inequality has been on the rise after historical decline, as Olivier was mentioning just before. So this is the evolution of the top 1% income share of the world in the USA and Western Europe. So to give us the orders, to have the orders of magnitude in mind, top 1% was about 20% of national income in the early 20th century in Europe, 16% in the US, strong reduction in the 20th century, down to 7-8% in both regions. So the role of the Great Depression, the role of the two world wars has been amply discussed over the past years, but it is important here to stress that a big chunk of this reduction also happens after the Second World War, so during peacetime policies. And since the 1970s, general increase, but what is perhaps even more important and interesting than this general increase is the diversity of the trends that we observe across countries. I'm here adding Japan, Australia, New Zealand, just to further reinforce the point of diversity within this general trend. I will subsequently focus more on the US and on Europe. Here is a close-up at the US and Europe inequality trends since 1980. And I was referring to the top 1% income share before, but what is happening to the bottom is equally important. And here is the evolution of the bottom 50% income share. You see the strong divergence in the growth, distributional growth pathways of these two regions, with the collapse of the bottom 50% income share in the US from about 20% in 1980 to 12.5% today. And in Europe, decrease in this share, but a very moderate increase, and in fact, a stabilization from the 1990s onwards. As Olivier was saying, the fact that these regions were exposed to broadly similar trends in terms of technological change. There are divergences in terms of their exposure to trade, but still they followed broadly similar exposure to trade with low-income and emerging countries. This highlights the importance of policies to drive these trends, and I will come back to this in a few slides. Let me, before this, turn to the distribution of wealth in these economies. Similar graph as the first one I presented. So that is the top 1% wealth share in these regions. Wealth was, again, to have the orders of magnitude in mind, about 50 to 55 to 65% of total wealth captured by the top 1% at the beginning of the 20th century. Strong reduction afterwards, and increase at diverging rhythms afterwards. Little point here on the potential impact of the financial crisis of 2008 on these trends. Well, it's hard to see a lot of an impact, at least when we look at the US trend. Broadly, the trend is broadly constant after the financial crisis. If you look at the blue curve, that is France, you see this big burst the hump around 2000. This is unrelated to the 2008 crisis. Again, the trend seems broadly unchanged around the Great Recession. I discussed this more at length in the paper. Let me have again a close-up, but now on the US experience, to show that, so these are the Shays and Zuckman series on US wealth inequality. The rise in the top 1% in the US is essentially a rise of the top 0.1% over the past 3 decades. What has been driving these trends? Well, there's a growing inequality of savings rates between the top 1, the top 0.1, and the entire bottom 99% of the distribution. So there has been a decrease in savings rate of the next 9%, that is the top 10 minus the top 1, and a stronger even decline of the savings rate of the bottom 90%. We observe this in the US, we also observe this in other advanced economies. Another important fact is the inequality of rates of return. And the higher you are in the wealth distribution, the higher your growth rate on wealth. So these are actual numbers. So here in the macro region, US and EU combined, we have relatively similar results when we look at these two regions separately, with slightly lower rates for the EU taken alone. So about 9% average annual growth rate of wealth at the very top of the distribution to be compared to what is happening to average wealth, 2.77%, and average income growing at 1% per adult in real terms over the period. So these trends have to be understood in the context of the rise of private wealth, the rise of aggregate wealth in the economy. But this is just to say that at the same time as wealth inequality was growing, the aggregate amount of wealth was also growing. So nations have become richer, but at the same time, governments have become poorer, in the sense that the total value of assets detained by governments, net of their debts, is now close to 0% of national income in rich countries. So this has implications on inequality insofar as governments with close to zero or below zero net public wealth position arguably have less scope to invest in policies such as education, such as health, such as, for instance, climate change protection, that might reduce inequality in the future. So were these trends about rising inequality in advanced economies, have they been counteracted? Have they been moderated or tempered by a rise in social mobility in rich countries? First things first, there is less systematic data on this dimension, less systematic data that is comparable across countries, but we have some information. Perhaps to start the discussion, when we look at countries at a given point of time, snapshot, countries with relatively low inequality levels associated with relatively high social mobility rates, countries with relatively high inequality levels associated with relatively low mobility rates. But what about the evolution of social mobility? I'm here mobilizing the work of Raj Chetty and his colleagues and co-authors. So this is the evolution of absolute mobility in the US from cohorts born in 1940 to cohorts born in 1985. And there is this strong reduction in absolute mobility over the years. 90% of Americans aged 30 earned more than their parents when they were born in 1940. This decreased to 50% today. When we look at relative mobility, so that is the probability of moving from the bottom to the top, there is a relative stagnation in the US over the past decades. Now, there's another way to think about mobility. This is mobility during one's lifetime. And if we look at overall individuals in the US, we find that this is broadly stable, but this hides important variations when we look at males on the one side versus females on the other side. And lifetime mobility was actually increased for females in the US and other advanced economies over the past decade. So this is the relatively positive side of the story that we're depicting here today. So gender, I will essentially focus on gender inequality in this presentation. More is in the background paper. So this is the evolution of gender inequality in the US. So that's the average pre-tax labor income of men aged 20 to 64 by the income of women. These are from the Piketty, Sayers, and Zuckman series. And we see this strong reduction in this total income gender gap. The gender gap, however, remains important in 2014. So men earn 70% more than women in the recent period. And if we look at full-time male workers and full-time female workers, the gender gap is also important, about 30%. Research shows that about half of this gap on full-time workers is explained by composition effects, and another half which is not explained by composition effects, so that is industrial sectors or the type of job that men and women are doing. So gender inequality remains strong, even though they have been strongly declining over the past half century. And another dimension and area where they remain particularly important is at the very top of the distribution. So this is an illustration for the case of France. You find similar results for other advanced economies for which we have that kind of information. If you look at the top 0.1%, we're very far from parity between male and women. Top 0.1%, only 10% in France are women. And if we continue at the same rate, we may have to wait for more than a century to reach parity. So let me rapidly touch on potential drivers behind the trends that I've been discussing before. And I'm coming back here to the Europe-US divergence over the past decades. And let's look at the bottom 50% of the distribution. So this is the pre-tax income growth rate, 3% overall over the period in the US, 40% in Europe. This gap is essentially a pre-tax income gap. So we still see a divergence when we look at post-tax income, but the bulk of the difference is made by pre-tax income differentials. So Europe was better able to trigger growth at the bottom, not mainly thanks to taxes and transfers, but to a better distribution of pre-tax income. So this highlights the role of pre-distribution in lifting incomes at the bottom. And again, here I want to stress the importance of policies on top of these standard explanations, which are trade and technology. The gap is so huge between the two regions that it's really hard to explain it with these standard drivers of inequality. So what can make this difference in pre-tax incomes at the bottom? I discuss a few potential drivers in the paper. One of them, access to education. We have that kind of data for the US. I'm also, again, here referring to the Chetty and co-author series. Very strong inequality in access to higher education, highly correlated to parental income. If you're at the top of the distribution, you have 90% chances to access higher education in the US. If you're at the bottom, you have just 30% chances. In Europe, in Scandinavian countries, in Germany, in Austria, we know that the inequality, the correlation between your parental income rank and your probability to access higher education is lower. And what is this due to? Well, not only, but this is partly due to different types of financing of higher education. Scandinavian countries, Germany, Austria, so Central European countries have free higher education. This is not the case on the other side of the Atlantic. A similar case could be made for the question of access to good quality healthcare. And the divide would be even stronger when we look at both sides of the Atlantic. Let me skip this question of wage formation, wage inequality. I'll leave this for the subsequent discussions. And I would like to finish with the question of progressive taxation. Recent research has made it clear that progressive taxation has had some impacts on growth rates at the top of the distribution, both post-tax growth rates, but also pre-tax growth rates. This is the evolution of top marginal income tax rates in rich countries. We see that there is, again, a general tendency to a declining of top marginal income taxation in rich countries, but that happened at different speeds with different amplitudes. And what this graph shows you is that the decline of top marginal income taxation, which you see on the horizontal axis, is relatively well associated with the variations in the top 1% income share over time. So indeed, progressive taxation is not only about income tax, it's also about property, estate, corporate taxation, and these need to be factored in the debates about policy. So let me finish and try to close the circle by coming back to this statement that we indeed cannot bring everybody, or we cannot ensure that the growth rate of everybody is above the average. But surely we can do much better than the current situation or the past 2 decades in Europe or the US, where a big part of the population, actually 85% of the population in the US, had a growth rate that was below the average. This is true before taxes and after taxes in this country. So we can do much better than what has been done before. And in order to do better, I think that the divergences that we observe between the US and Europe, and within Europe where we also observe different patterns of growth and of the distribution of growth, matter a lot. So I've rapidly discussed about pre-distribution policies, access to education, to health, high-paid job. I've also discussed the role of progressive taxation. Now, my final comment would be to say that pre- and redistribution have sometimes been opposed in research and public debates, and I believe it is time to reconsider their roles as complementary tools or elements of the policy toolkit rather than substitute. Indeed, pre-distribution policies also need to be financed, and progressive taxation is one effective way to do so in the context of highly unequal pre-tax distribution of growth. Thank you so much for your attention.
So to comment on Lucas Chancel of the World Inequality Lab, I am asking Peter Diamond of MIT, Nobel laureate in economics. That's your bio.
Thank you for that excessive introduction. Luca has done a absolutely terrific job. And I want to point out what he did was by comparing different groups. So what you didn't see was an index of inequality. I'll get back to that later on. What you saw was there are lots of groups that are doing very badly compared to other groups, with, of course, the race and gender adjustment. And so my thought to begin with, my sense of real focus and a widely held view, the last 40 years have been really disappointing economically for lots and lots of people. And there are lots of causes feeding into it. And one of the attractions of the presentation was parsing out, by looking across countries as well as looking over time, an array of factors that are relevant, the array that we'll be hearing about with the concrete proposals, which have been wonderfully assembled by Olivier and Danny. There are lots, and Olivier suggested to me that I consider the link between what Luca has shown us and how to discuss the policy issues that will be coming up. And that seemed to make sense to me as long as I restricted it to the only area where I actually know anything about how you're supposed to go from analysis to policy, and that's public economics. So I'm going to discuss that link in the context of two types of changes. The obvious one is raising revenue by taxation, but the second one is considering spending programs that have significant spending. The question is, how should you think about the cost of the spending along with the benefits that are coming to lots of people? So another way of putting it is, to my mind, is we've had too little investment in lots of things. There's a litany out there. I don't need to add to it. I would happily repeat it, but I've only got 20 minutes. So another aspect which Lucas showed us is large growth of private capital, shrinking of public capital. And I think that's highly relevant because the attitude toward spending out of tax money comes with the status of the financial position of the government generally. And we've got a lot of problems on that account. So too little revenue, too little investment is the simple theme. And so let me go to that issue. How do you think about the cost of spending? How do you think about the costs associated with raising revenue in a more progressive manner? There are two aspects of this that I'm going to talk about. First is just the cost element, and the second is the bundling element. In the political discussion of programs, sometimes programs are very popular, sometimes the budget is in very good shape, and so you think about what you'd like to spend the money on, and there's a competition just across spending. Other times what you do is you say, I propose this wonderful spending opportunity, and no surprise, somebody says, how are you going to pay for it? So you bundle some new tax increase along with the spending. And there's the issue of if you had a broad agenda like the one we're seeing in this conference, what kind of bundling would you do? What taxes would you bundle with what spending? We know from seeing the campaigns what kind of taxes the Democratic candidates think are very popular. We also know what kind of taxes the Republicans think is very popular. That's a non-overlapping connection there. So let me touch very briefly on this issue of inequality measure. In figure 9, which we didn't see, Luca had it. It was to make the point that globally, inequality within countries has become relatively more important, and inequality across countries, therefore less so, uses a tile index and breaks it out. I went back to Tony Atkins's famous 1970 paper. It's a shame Tony is not available to be here. And he wrote, the conventional approach in nearly all empirical work is to adopt some summary statistic of inequality, such as the variance, the coefficient of variation, or the Gini coefficient, with no very explicit reason being given for preferring one measure rather than another. As, however, was pointed out by Dalton 50 years ago, underlying any such measure is some concept of social welfare. And it is with this concept that we should be concerned. He argued that we should approach the question by considering directly the form of the social welfare function to be employed. And as I'm sure you all remember, Tony looked at a sum of identical utility functions of income or consumption, with the curvature and weighting being the critical element. Now, part of the problem in the American context is that the aversion to taxation is extremely long-standing. And I've got a quote I love. It's from James Madison. It's 1782. The Revolutionary War is still going on. The Continental Army is complaining that Congress isn't giving them enough money. And he wrote in a letter, we have shed our blood in the glorious cause in which we are engaged. We are ready to shed the last drop in its defense. Nothing is above our courage, except only, with shame I speak it, the courage to tax ourselves. And that logic was, I think, a critical ingredient in the process of going from the Articles of Confederation, which ruled then, to the Constitution. The Constitution, some of you may remember, was then followed by Shays Rebellion, which was triggered largely by taxes. So we've come a considerable way from that, but the change in attitude is highly limited. I'll give you one more quote. It's from Alan Greenspan. It's 1978. Just at the start of the 40 years we're lamenting. He's testifying. He had been the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Ford. He was speaking before the Senate Finance Committee in support of the Kemp-Roth bill. Let us remember that the basic purpose of any tax cut program in today's environment is to reduce the momentum of expenditure growth by restraining the amount of revenues available, and trust that there is a political limit to deficit spending. The thrust of my claim, if we want to think about spending, we've got to think about revenue, is in the context where this is not going to be a politically easy element. So let me turn to the cost of revenue. And what you will commonly see, you have a program, you'll say it'll cost 10 something or others, but because of the deadweight burdens of raising the revenue, the real cost is pick a larger number, 150, 170, what have you. What is very peculiar about this discussion is that the distortions in the tax are, in fact, designed around concern with income distribution. And yet, when you turn to the cost, it's not there. So in order to make sense of the cost to benefit discussion in a social welfare context, you've got to put them in the same categories. That common way of doing it lacks the logic that says income distribution matters sometimes, but not other times. So what I want to tell you about is drawing on some work by Boss Jacobs. And he asks the question, if we have a Murley's economy, a one-period labor-only economy, and we have the familiar asymmetric information problem, we can observe people's incomes but not their abilities, and we have any progressive income tax we want, and we have the ability to have a universal basic income, a flat sum, the opposite of a poll tax that goes to everybody. And now let's say we have some social welfare function that we're judging things by, and let's assume we set the tax structure to optimize given that social welfare function. Then we can consider the rule, the Samuelson public good rule, and ask, what is it we want to compare the benefits to the households with? And the answer is the cost is 1. Because you could take it out of the universal basic income. That's a flat amount for everybody. That doesn't have standard deadweight burdens. It may have income effects affecting revenue, but that's part of the social marginal value of income as opposed to the social marginal value of consumption. And it's 1. And it comes from the fact that if you're optimizing on taxes, then you've traded off the deadweight burdens in exactly the optimal way. And therefore, it's already integrated into the cost element. So this is, I think, by itself doesn't answer questions because we don't do policies with simultaneously maximizing all the revenue and all the spending. We do things a piece at a time. We do things with varying instructions from different groups. So it doesn't take us anywhere, but it says the standard way of doing it doesn't work. What we need, which I don't think has been developed yet, is how to do that kind of thinking in a bundled setting. So let me turn to bundling. And the point here, the area I work in, Social Security, is so popular as a program that when surveys explore with people, whether in focus groups or generally, the willingness to see the payroll tax rate go up as part of preserving Social Security. Yes, they're much happier at the idea of taxing the well-off, but they're also favorable on doing that. Yes, some benefit cuts are also part of the common view, but they both come in. So a question for the common practice of taxing the very well-off to rescue Social Security is, don't we want to use the payroll? If you think these other spendings are also very important, don't we want to do that? Now, the last section in Luca's paper talked about future drivers of inequality, and he mentions climate change. And I want to didn't make it onto the program for concretes. I want to make the point that there is a serious inequality element in there. Luca makes that point as well. I haven't found any data tracking it down. There are some papers out there. So I drew on what we see from the things that are happening now that are attributed in part to climate change, the droughts, the greater hurricanes, and to a large extent, think about New Orleans, the extent to which low-income, low-wealth people are exposed to the bad effects, are limited in their ability to adapt to them, and then it becomes worse down the road. So I think climate change belongs on this list. A second future driver is Social Security. As I suspect everyone is aware, under current law, that part everyone may not be aware, if the projection is right, in 16 years, everybody will get a 20% benefit cut. Social Security is not empowered to borrow. Social Security must not spend more than is coming in on the payroll tax. It doesn't go bankrupt in the sense of nothing that many people fear. 20% benefit cut. If you think of the distributional role of Social Security, it's a big player in what might happen. Nobody that I'm aware of thinks that will happen. It didn't happen in 1983, and people think it won't happen, but we will have a significant fight over the extent to which it's done by budget cuts. For comparison of two similarly timed proposals, there was one by the Republican head of the Social Security Subcommittee of Social Security and by the Democratic head. One of them had no revenue increases and, in fact, a revenue decrease by cutting benefits enough. The other wanted to not just cover the deficit, but raise benefits by tax increases. One of the items on the agenda is, should we have a sovereign wealth fund that somehow supports people? We have a sovereign wealth fund. Social Security has $2.9 trillion. In '83, the plan was to build it up and run it down to zero. In contrast, to take two countries well regarded for their pension systems, Canada and Sweden have substantial funds which are invested like sovereign wealth funds, are dedicated to the pensions, and are meant to stay there. They use various automatic adjustments so that the funds don't disappear. I can't imagine the politics in the US allowing the standard sovereign wealth fund kind of investment. But I can imagine letting Social Security funds be invested with the thrift savings plan. The thrift savings plan is a defined contribution plan for federal employees. There are over 3 million people in it, so it's as large as many countries' pension systems. The government organizes it. They're all index funds except government bonds, and they're bid on by firms that handle index funds in the market. The number of basis points being charged vary a little bit, but I think the largest is 3 basis points for handling the index fund. And there are, I think now 5 or 7, it's slowly grown so you can get a diversified portfolio. There has been 0 congressional meddling with the thrift savings plan, which was one of the worries when it was created at the same time that the old system was disassembled because federal employees were new hires were going into Social Security. So the thought that we could build on what is functioning extremely well is a good thought. And the same thing could be used by opening it up to individual IRAs. Thank you.
Let me ask if you have 2 minutes worth of any particular responses to Peter's comments, then I'll just ask a couple clarifying questions before turning to the audience.
Thanks so much for these comments, and let me remind here that I'm here the voice of dozens and dozens of researchers. This is really a collective endeavor, and I wanted to pick up this point about the type of summary measures we use to measure inequality, and the Tony Atkinson reference and encouragement to think about the underlying welfare functions behind the synthetic indicators we use. And I think we've been using Gini indicators, tile indexes, perhaps too much. And it's true that it's hardly tractable from the point of view of policymakers, from the point of view of the general public, what these evolution mean. And so this is why we really try to publish on the World Inequality Database and really try to push, to encourage for the publication of quantile share indicators. What is the growth rate of the bottom 10%, bottom 50%, next 40%, top 10, top 1, etc., and so on and so forth. And just the policy implication of this is, I think, that statistical institutions should provide these measures, and this is what a law, I think, in the U.S. Senate is trying to advocate for. That is the publication by the BEA every year of distributional national accounts. This might be also included in the next revision of the UN system of national accounts by 2022, 2023, and I think that this can make a huge difference to how we frame policy debates. So that was just one point. Let's use more disaggregated indicators, but we need the statistical basis for that. Second point, climate change. I think the difficulty is that we need to fix current inequalities, but we also need to anticipate what's coming next. And the difficulty with climate change is that it might reinforce between, but also within country inequalities, but fixing climate change might also have distributional implications. And this is what we observe when we see, for instance, in France, carbon tax is implemented and there's social unrest because a lot of people feel that this is a regressive taxation, which is the case. And we see that in emerging countries as well. So this is a real also challenge for policy making and economic policy analysis in the years to come.
As Peter indicated, and you all have available the paper here, it is already or is about to be posted on the PIE website, 10 Facts About Inequality in Advanced Economies. There are some very rich appendix tables and other tables that, thanks to discipline on time, Luca did not get to. In particular, there's a figure on Appendix Figure 9 I particularly want to point to because it compares China, Germany, India, and the U.S., their distribution of income over time. And what's striking, I'm not going to hold it up because you're not going to be able to see it, but of course that there has been quite a bit of convergence from these major emerging markets on the rich world, particularly at the top end. But also the biggest move, in a sense, in the curves, besides China's growth across the distribution, is the collapse of income in the low end of the USA distribution. And so this just underscores a point that Luca was making. And so I'd just like to ask him a bit more about this sort of juxtaposition, that it seems on the one hand that a lot of this has to do with values we may dislike about a strong political group in the U.S. pushing for upwards redistribution and demonizing the poor, if I may put it that way. But that seems to be a policy matter, whereas you're also saying that most of the evidence or most of the distinction of the U.S., for example, comes from pre-tax and transfer. I'm not saying there's a contradiction there at all, but if you could expand a little bit on this sort of juxtaposition of U.S. exceptionalism when taxes and transfers are not by any means the whole story.
Thanks for pointing out this, global perspective, because this is indeed something that I tried to leave aside in the presentation that is also in the paper, and that also matters a lot in current discussions on inequality in rich countries, because we feel that it's more and more important to compare, and that the middle class is comparing itself with what is happening in the emerging world. So one of the known facts about inequality in rich countries is also the so-called global elephant curve of inequality and growth, first introduced by Branko Milanovic. I think it's a very nice representation of what happened to growth and inequality in the context of globalization over the past 30 years, and indeed is this idea of a squeezed middle class in rich countries, both within rich countries and from a global perspective. So what I tried to show in this paper is that basically we move on from a world where nationality matters more than class to account for global inequalities in 1980 to today where social groups within countries matter more than nationality. And to come to your question about what is happening in the US, it is true that I don't see any contradiction between the fact that pre-tax inequality is what is driving the difference between Europe and the US, and that the growth of pre-tax incomes seem to be largely determined by access to education, access to health, access to high-paid jobs, and that there is, to some extent, yes, a refusal to provide access to these services, to these public services that Europeans are providing to everybody.
Thank you. Peter, I'll come to you in a second, but I just wanted to flag, to underline this last point, two other very important charts, I think, in the paper. Figure 14 on trade with emerging economies and inequality, and figure 18, the decline of tax progressivity in rich countries. And this just further underlines this point, that a lot of concern, particularly in the US presidential race, is the idea that trade with poorer countries is impoverishing the US, and clearly there are some effects, as Richard Freeman famously said at this stage before many other places, are your wages set in Beijing? But the fact is that we have very similar rise in imports from emerging countries across the wealthy countries and very wide divergences in the extent of inequality. And similarly, we have very little divergence in the tax progressivity of rich countries on these charts. So it just sort of underlines these longer-term factors, in a sense, these public investment factors. I don't know, Peter, if you want to add anything on this.
Let me just make a point about the labor market. It also appears in consumer markets. What we're seeing is a dramatic change in bargaining power. And, you know, a search theorist, I think of that as something that really, really matters. And it's coming from a number of places involving technology, involving alternatives, involving the ability to do things, to learn about things, and all sorts of things that need attention. The chief of police at MIT said the internet and the computer with it is the greatest increase in criminal opportunity since the automobile. The automobile gave us the FBI because local police couldn't deal anymore. And in terms of addressing this, state governments don't have the ability to do things. Again, we need federal things. So I think we need a lot of fundamental rethinking. I know there's discussion about antitrust policies. We've got to remember corporations get limited liability because the government gives it to them. If the government wants to tie strings to that in any way, shape, or form, that may have efficiency implications, it may have income distribution implications, but it doesn't seem to get into the issue of what are fundamental rights.
David Otter, MIT Economics. So appreciated the discussion very much. One thing that I thought was underemphasized in Lucas's presentation, maybe it's more emphasized in the paper, and I apologize I haven't studied it closely, was the role of education in inequality and how much of the growth of inequality is not the top 10% or the top 1% versus everybody else, but the rise of inequality in the other 99% of the distribution, and how strongly that is associated with rising returns to education, and of course, the incredibly dispersed skill distribution, especially in the United States. And as you did point out, the very strong correlation between household income and college going in the US. But I think it's important to emphasize that because education is much more in people's control than their odds of being in the top 1%. You can't just decide to be in the top 1%, but you probably can, improve your educational prospects. And I'll stop here except to say it's a little bit counterproductive to just focus on that top income share because that's only one of the areas of leverage for policy that's not within the reach of most citizens. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think access to get education matters essentially at the bottom of the distribution. I think I tried to argue for that. Now, it's true also that when we look at the composition of skills within the top 1 or top 0.1%, there is little variance across individuals at the very top of the distribution. And if we look at the inequality of top CEOs of top companies in one side or the other of the Atlantic, we see potentially little variation in their educational degrees and their skills, but very high pay differentials. So what I try to argue is in the paper is that yes, it's largely a matter of what is happening at the bottom and not at the top.
Thank you.
David,
Sorry, go ahead.
let me just say the litany that I didn't bother with of the investments we need a lot more revenue to address. Education is certainly part of that, starting with preschool and running on up. That will be in one of the programs. But I think we've got to recognize the shortcomings around the financing, the politics of financing. But yes, I think you're right on target.
Claire Jones, Financial Times. Thanks a lot for a very interesting presentation. I mean, something that I thought was quite starkly brought home was that the phenomenon looks very different if you look at the US case compared with the Western European case. Now, I was wondering if in my undergraduate studies, in my school studies of economics, one of the things that was really pointed out was that the marginal propensity to consume tends to be a lot higher among lower income people than higher income people. And I was wondering if there'd been any kind of like cross area work done on how these patterns have really affected consumption patterns in either the US or in Europe.
So thanks for this question. So the World Inequality Lab project was initiated with the use of tax data, and so largely focused on income distributions. And so there needs to be a reconciliation, I believe, between global consumption inequality research and global income inequality research. And this is really an exciting avenue for future research. And so far, we just have distributions of income, consumption, savings, and wealth for a few countries. And we need to further build up these systematic estimates across countries in a comparative manner from the bottom to the very top of the distribution. This still remains a strong area for research. Just one point on that, on consumption differentials across income groups. I think this is also, if I may just connect this back to the question of climate change, where we also see that consumption patterns vary a lot across groups, and the consumption of energy also varies a lot across group, and the share of energy is indeed much higher for low-income groups than for top-income groups. And this is where the difficulty starts when you introduce carbon taxation schemes. But let me just say again on this point that a lot of countries were able to tax the consumption of energy in a way that was relatively progressive, because this was included in overall progressive tax schemes, or this was complemented by compensatory mechanisms, making it possible to have an overall, fair, taking into account of both the climate change objective and both the inequality in the consumption of energy.
Jason Furman, Harvard Kennedy School, and Peterson Institute for International Economics. I had a question for you, Lucas, about the relationship between survey data and administrative data. A well-designed survey, you ask the same way every year, and you're pretty confident that the results are comparable across years. Administrative data, especially tax data, was never designed to produce statistics for economists to use. It has a big advantage in terms of the sample size and in terms of the coverage at the very top, but it has a big disadvantage, which is the questions that are asked on the tax returns change quite a lot from year to year. In particular, the tax rates change a lot from year to year. So the first question I have is, how confident can we be when we look in the past, for example, and observe high taxes and low incomes, that that was either coincidental, two different things, the low incomes are a real thing that were caused by the high tax rates, or because we're trying to measure it with an instrument and the instrument has high tax rates, that some people hide, shelter, disguise more of their income. So that's sort of question one. How sure are we that we're measuring an invariant thing over time? How do we validate that? Question two is, do you have plans going forward to combine administrative data with survey data on the distributional side? That won't help you with the top 1/1000th of 1%, but the census in the United States asks about the quintiles every year. Sometimes those tell a different story than the tax returns. I would think some combination of extracting the information from both would be superior to either one individually. I don't think you've done that. Do you have plans to do that? What do you think it would change?
Thanks a lot, Jason, for these questions. I think that this is a central point, and a few countries actually match survey data with administrative tax registers, and these countries also happen to be, kind of low inequality countries that we're generally referring to, Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, for instance. And perhaps there's a connection between these two facts, there perhaps also needs to be a good understanding of what is happening, and this is why these countries are actually doing that, matching survey data with administrative registers. And so I think this should be the objective, that governments should be able to match these data sets. And researchers should not have to do that with the means that we have, basically, with imperfect information, with the tools that we have, but this always remains imperfect. That said, I think that combining survey and tax provides much more reliable information than survey alone. I think one of the key issues, as you mentioned, is sample size, especially at the very, very top. But it's also the fact that survey, I don't really agree with the fact that they do not vary over time. Questionnaires very much vary over time. They very much vary across countries. And this is one of the key conclusions of the Canberra group on survey, the use of household survey data, that they are hardly comparable over time and over countries. Now, when we move from tax data to distributional national accounts, so this is the objective of this DINA, Distributional National Accounts project, what we find is that this does not contradict the results that come from the earlier tax literature, the earlier top share literature based just on tax data. This gives more insights into variations. Perhaps this can slightly upgrade the level of top shares, slightly reduce them, but the broad general pictures, when we factor in retained earnings, when we factor in sources of income that are not on tax, do not just confirm the broad general picture. And so to stress again this point, I think it's really up to, we live still in the prehistory of the age of inequality information, and we are in the digital age. So there's a clear paradox here. We cannot build proper inequality policies if we don't have this very basic information. So we're really trying to do the best we can, but still there's a much more that governments could do to provide this kind of information.
Sandy Darity at Duke University. I wanted to reflect a bit on your observations about growing inequality being associated with growth in differentials in savings rates. And I was wondering if you could comment on which way you see the causality running. I think one could argue very easily that savings rates are a function of household income and wealth levels. Rather than saying that it's the variations in the savings rates that are driving wealth or income variations. Okay. I'd also like to add that there's a much weaker relationship between human capital and wealth than there is between human capital and income if we're talking about human capital as being associated with educational attainment. And I think one of the most striking illustrations is the fact that if we look at racial wealth differences in the United States, Black heads of households with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of households who never finished high school. And indeed, I think I'd like to hear more about what you had to say about racial wealth inequality, because that's what dropped out of your discussion in the interest of time.
So two points. Let me start with the second one. So racial inequality. Here, there's also again a data gap between Anglo-Saxon countries and continental European countries, where you just don't have access to wealth information. So wealth income inequality in the U.S. was largely reduced was reduced over the 20th century. But what more recent trends show is an increase in racial wealth gaps, and also largely after the consequences of the financial crisis, where African American households were more hit than the others. Now, turning to the point on savings inequality, of course, the direction goes in two ways, for sure. Now, when we look at simple models of wealth accumulation and wealth concentration, what comes out of these models is that slight changes in savings rate inequality can have strong and long-lasting impacts on capital concentration. And so one way to think about that is, yes, the income inequality drives savings inequality, which drives wealth accumulation and wealth inequality in the long run, even though there's indeed a feedback loop that is happening in the US and in other countries as well.
In the research on the functioning of labor markets, the researchers typically make a distinction between Anglo-Saxon and continental European institutions. And that seems to explain a number of differences across outcomes. If you adopt that, you would think that the UK would look more like the US than like continental Europe. If I'm right, and I've seen some of the figures and not all of them today, it looks as if the UK is actually more like continental Europe, that the increase in inequality is much more limited than in the US. And so this raises questions about, what kind of institutions explain what's going on. It's not the trivial Anglo-Saxon continental European distinction, it's something else. And the fact that there was no increase, or not much of an increase in inequality in the UK, in some of the figures, I found quite striking.
True point. I mean, at least one of the convergence between the UK model and the continental European model. Well, we can't say that it's higher education, but we can argue that access to health might make a big role in triggering growth at the bottom and in limiting inequalities in access to health.
Just to say, as someone who's been tracking UK data rather closely for a number of years, this is it's great to have Lucas presented in this general context, but this is a very robust result, and the usual emphasis is the NHS, both the existence of universal health care and then, obvious to this audience, the spillovers of what that means for savings rates, that accidents and problems don't set people back in the way they do in the US. I mean, it's not the whole thing, but that really seems to underline it. Thank you all very much.